The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy Gray with Shoreline, and I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar today, Contactless, Are You Ready to Ride the Next Wave of EMV? Today we're joined by one of our Shoreline and Gemalto Company resident EMV experts, Philippe Benitez. Welcome, Philippe.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us today. And as most of everyone out there knows, Shoreline has been producing payment cards and personalization services for 25 years in the U.S. And today we're going to learn more about contactless EMV. You might know this as dual interface cards. Contactless EMV is changing the way people pay around the world, and now it's finally here in America. At the end of the webinar, we're going to have some time for question and answers about anything and everything EMV or contactless. So please feel free to type your questions in the question box towards the right of your screen during the presentation, and we will do our best to answer all of your questions. We're also going to have a recording of the webinar up on our website this week. So if you go to shorelinecards.com, you can find it there. And we'll be sending a PDF copy of the presentation out along with a link to the recording. So I think that's pretty much all the housekeeping tips. I think we're ready to get started. So I'm going to turn it over to Philippe. Thank you very much, Philippe, for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on the webinar today about contactless, which is the next wave in your EMV migration. Before we start diving into the topic, I wanted to give you a quick overview of the broader Gemalto, because we are the global leader in digital security, and we play in many markets in addition to payments. So we're present in 180 countries. We have revenue of $3.3 billion in 2014. More than 2 billion consumers around the world benefit from our solutions, whether those are in the payment space, in the mobile space, in the government and ID space, and in the machine-to-machine space. And what drives our ability to provide solutions to all of you and to all of our customers around the world is our strong focus on innovation, with more than 3,000 engineers around the world who are developing new and secure solutions for these verticals. So specifically in payments, we're the largest supplier of payment cards in the world. Visa, MasterCard branded, American Express, JCB, and many other labels that are used around the world. And to give you an idea, we shipped 2.5 billion chip cards in 2014, and that, if you want an image of what that looks like, those cards put end to end would circle the equator 5 times. And if you laid those cards flat on the ground and side by side, we could cover the entire United States coast to coast with those 2.5 billion cards. Specifically on the EMV side, which is the payment use case of chip cards, we're about twice as large as our closest competitor, with 730 million EMV card shipments in 2014. So a lot of experience in this space. And as you all know, in the US, the EMV migration is well underway. It started a couple of years ago, and I'm sure all of you have been very busy integrating to comply with the processing requirements that EMV brings, and you're probably now in the phases of looking at the issuance side of the EMV migration. Most of the Tier 1 banks in the United States have completed their migrations. You know, I've gotten my cards in the mail. You probably have gotten your cards in the mail from various of your banks. And in 2015, the industry consensus is that 575 million EMV cards were shipped to personalization bureaus around the US. And 2016 will exceed that number. So the migration is underway full steam on the issuance side, and on the merchant side or the acceptance side as well. In 2015, we saw about 60% of all terminals in the US support EMV cards or EMV transactions. And by the end of this year, we expect to see about 3/4 of all terminals in the US supporting EMV transactions. Okay, so that side of the equation is also progressing very nicely. So as issuers, it's not too late to launch your EMV program with Shoreline. For sure, launching EMV can be a daunting task. And the good news is that because of all of the experience of the issuers that have come before you and of the work we have completed to prepare ourselves for the massive US migration, you can benefit from a turnkey solution that helps you get to market faster with our Processor Ready program. And what that means is that we the products that you will require with the relevant brands. So our card products, our profiles are pre-approved by the payment associations. They are Durbin compliant, of course, for debit. And as Amy was mentioning, we are serving the US market since 25 years, and we're the #1 EMV card supplier in the US. We've actually supplied 1 out of every 3 EMV cards in the US in 2015. So think of this Processor Ready program as a plug-and-play EMV program that you can benefit from, that removes the complexity that you would otherwise have to handle because we front-loaded that work. Okay. So EMV is essentially a large project for you, and it's your first step into the world of digital payments. So if you look at this slide here, I've tried to categorize payment technologies according to the type of security they bring, the type of convenience they bring, and where these payment technologies are used, right? Whether for card present, face-to-face purchases, or card not present purchases. And EMV sits at the upper left-hand corner here. EMV provides security for face-to-face transactions for card-present purchases. And US issuers, because of the massive scale and the speed with which the US migrated to EMV, US issuers picked the simplest form of EMV for this phase 1 of the migration. And by the simplest form, I mean simple contact EMV with, in many cases, chip and signature, and in some cases, a chip and pin, but trying to keep it as simple as possible. And everywhere else around the world, after this first phase, contactless came next. So contactless EMV, which is also known as dual interface, essentially allows you to use your EMV card with the same level of security, but instead of dipping and waiting, you tap on the terminal to complete the transaction in under a second. In some cases, some countries decided to go to dual interface / contactless EMV first, but in most cases, what we've seen is that phase 1 was contact EMV and phase 2 followed with contactless EMV. And what contactless EMV brings to the picture is convenience, and that's why I've highlighted that, convenience and speed, of course, in this little 2x2 diagram. And it has also brought a lot of additional benefits that we'll look at. So as a result of these benefits and the added convenience that contactless brings, we've seen contactless EMV hit mass deployment levels around the world as well, with 2015 showing about I like to round numbers, so round numbers, 1.5 billion contactless cards deployed around the world. In 2015, that represents about 40% of all cards shipped with this contactless dual interface capability. And in parallel, the other side of that coin is point-of-sale terminals. More than 3 million contactless-enabled point-of-sale terminals shipped around the world to accept those cards. So there's a hockey stick phenomenon there with contactless deployments. And because contactless is just another variant of EMV, nothing on the backhaul changes, right? The transaction processing remains the same, and contactless payment has overtaken contact and become a global standard in most of the rest of the world, as you can see here, in Australia, in China, in all of Europe, Russia, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, and so on and so forth. So very large economies have migrated to contactless. And in Europe, MasterCard and Visa are mandating contactless acceptance by 2020, which means that all terminals in Europe must include contactless acceptance capabilities by that date for them to pass certifications. So what are the drivers for this mass adoption of contactless and this hockey stick chart that we saw? Well, several benefits. The first benefit is increased revenue for both merchants and issuers, because contactless card brings this additional convenience and speed, this improved customer experience that you see at the bottom there in orange. This added convenience helps consumers use their cards for more of their everyday purchases, including cash. So the increased revenue comes from these transactions on contactless that would otherwise go to other forms of payment. New revenue streams, this comes from non-traditional markets such as mobile, for example. Foundation for innovative payment channels. Once again, contactless is the foundational technology. Contactless EMV is the foundational technology used in all mobile payments deployments as well. And so it enables new use cases through those channels. From the consumer side, it's a no-brainer, right? Consumers, once they try tap and go payments, they never go back to dipping and waiting. And we've seen this around the world, including up north in Canada, our Canadian neighbors. This is an example here from Australia, and what it depicts is when one of the largest Australian merchants, called Coles, which is equivalent to their Walmart, right, on a national scale. When Coles migrated to contactless terminals in June of 2012 there, with the line, contactless transactions at the point of sale skyrocketed and ended up representing more than 70% of all transactions a couple of years ago, and probably today this number is much higher. I don't have the latest data for that. But the same situation happened in other countries around the world, including in Canada, like I mentioned, New Zealand, UK, China, Singapore, many countries where more than 10% of all transactions are now being done using tap-and-go payments. Another use case is sale terminals that accept contactless card increase, spend almost doubled in the 5-month period after several of the largest merchants and the London Underground, the Tube, began accepting contactless payments. And
Steve,
in 2015,
I hate to interrupt, but we lost your audio. If you could just go back over the slide again. A few people
this slide,
are
okay.
asking. Yeah,
No
thank
problem.
you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, now you're
Okay.
you're loud and clear now. Thank you very much.
Okay, very good. Very good, no problem. So what I was saying was that the UK is another interesting use case for contactless. They first deployed their contactless programs in 2007, and at that time it was more of a test to validate the adoption of the technology by consumers and by merchants. And since then, it's turned into a must-have, right? I mentioned the European mandate for 2020 previously. So now it's become a must-have. And what they've seen in the UK with the increase in acceptance of contactless transaction with terminalization, so more than 300,000 contactless point-of-sale terminals deployed, and 75 million contactless banking cards deployed, what they've seen is that contactless spend with these deployments has doubled in the period from January to June 2015. And it now represents more than 2.5 billion pounds, so roughly $5 billion, right? Approximately 1 to 2 for the pound to the US dollar. One of the drivers for this was the increase in the spending limit for no signature, no PIN, from 20 pounds to 30 pounds, which allowed consumers to use contactless for more of their everyday spend. In one space, which is it, right? These are usually low-value payments, but something that requires high speed at the turnstile. The London Tube or the subway migrated to contactless technology, and you can see here how the number of transactions per day, as more turnstiles accepted contactless payments, right, doubled practically month to month. So every month, 2x more transactions than the previous month, ending in June 2015 here, which is where we have data. We see 1.2 million contactless transactions per day in the London Tube, just because of the speed, ease, and convenience and security that contactless provides. Once consumers became accustomed to the tapping, right, tapping and going or tapping to pay, this behavior carried over into other areas of their lives, specifically groceries, right? That's the next highest category of spend, if you think about it, on a daily basis. Once grocery stores implemented contactless terminals at the point of sale, the number of transactions made with contactless card started overtaking other forms of payment. So today, 44% of all contactless transactions are completed using tap-and-go payments at the supermarket. A quarter of all transactions are tap-and-go in fast food restaurants, and in the Tube we already talked about. And as a matter of fact, at the beginning of this, as we were preparing for this webinar, Amy showed me an article that was published a couple of days ago showing that the data, if you project it to 2020, contactless will overtake cash in terms of volume, dollar volume of transactions in the UK. That's a pretty significant milestone. So one of the ways in which the stakeholders increase contactless card usage or motivate consumers to use contactless cards and motivate merchants to terminalize is by increasing the limit at which the cardholder verification is required. So previously in the UK it was set at £20. When they increased that limit to £30, where no PIN, no signature, no cardholder verification would be required, simply tap and go, pick up your stuff and leave the store, transactions increased significantly. So, for example, plus 92% growth in transactions at bars and pubs, 62% at fast food restaurants, and plus 50% in restaurants. And 8 in 10 customers use less cash than a year ago because they prefer to tap and go rather than mess with cash. So all of that is to say that in the US, coming back to the US and the current state of affairs, the dip in weight nature of contact EMV is not meeting expectations. And right before this webinar, once again, I was at Whole Foods getting a snack, and the guy ahead of me dipped his EMV card, and he pulled it before the transaction was completed, and so he had to start all over, and it was a long delay. Everyone was frustrated. He was frustrated. The cashier was frustrated, and I was frustrated because I needed to get here in time, right, to be on this webinar. So this dip in weight aspect of contact EMV is not meeting expectations for speed of both merchants and consumers. The benefit of contactless EMV, of course, is that it brings the same speed as MagStripe, the same speed as swipe, right? Swipe and go, tap and go. It offers a more frictionless user experience, and it creates a consistent experience between cards and other form factors such as mobile. So contactless EMV, you see at the bottom here with this little chart, if you imagine contactless being 1x, right, contact EMV adds an extra 10 to 25 seconds to the transaction, depending on the merchant. So you can imagine for high traffic merchants, this delta of an additional 10 to 25 seconds is pretty huge. And the good news is that contactless payment is also on its way to the US. So we are not staying behind the curve in that respect. And we expect a very strong hockey stick curve again in the coming quarters with the commercial launch of contactless in a few portfolios of 4 out of the 10 top US issuers. So prepare to see some of those cards hit the market within the next couple of quarters. This is made possible because 100% of EMV terminals in the US are contactless capable. Now, capable does not mean that they are turned on, and as the cards begin to reach the hands of consumers, merchants will begin enabling the contactless or turning it on at the point of sale so that they can accept this faster and more convenient form of payment. And 7 out of 15, so about half of the top retailers in the US will support contactless acceptance by 2016. And Whole Foods does, by the way, just as a little side note. So that's contactless, the benefits it brings, why it is that in the US we're beginning to see it, or we will begin to see it very shortly, and everywhere else we have seen it. Contactless, what happens now? Once it becomes available in card form, it is already available in mobile form. I like to call it mobile EMV, right? Because the contactless payments via mobile use the same underlying EMV security standard as cards do. And we'll see other form factors as well, such as wearable devices, that are contactless payment enabled. One example of those is the BPay band here, which is a contactless payment band. So in cities that have large tourism events, we've seen strong acceptance of this kind of form factor of a contactless bracelet, if you will, that unlocks VIP experiences or special access for consumers, while at the same time providing standard Visa or MasterCard contactless payment capabilities. And these are being deployed in the hundreds of thousands around the world. So that's it in a nutshell, a little whirlwind tour of EMV and contactless and how it's being deployed around the world. I can't see your questions in the chat boxes, but I'll give it back to Amy and hopefully answer a few of your questions.
I will. We do have a number of questions for you, Philippe. We have a lot of whys. Why is contactless faster than contact, and why didn't the U.S. just go right to contactless if this is what the rest of the world is doing? So those two whys are.
Okay, very good. So I'll answer the first one. Why is contactless faster? The reason is that the way the transaction is processed by the card or executed by the card was optimized for that specific use case, while maintaining the same level of security. And the design of that algorithm and the way the cryptogram is generated and the way the transaction is put together was designed specifically to enable, sub 500 millisecond interaction with the point of sale terminal. So that is the why. And the first use case where this was required was in the transportation space for open loop payments at turnstiles in major cities with subway systems and bus systems and so on and so forth, that required the same level of security as full contact EMV, but much faster transaction speeds. And then once consumers started tapping to get on the bus or to get on the subway, merchants saw an opportunity within the subway systems themselves to begin accepting that card, and then it kind of spilled over, right, into other aspects of commerce. And the second question,
I found your thing about the tube in London. It's like once people started using it there, do you think that the public became more felt confident and they weren't worried about using that contactless option because they got used to it? And that's kind of why it took off?
yeah, and very good. And to answer the second question, which is why did we not go straight to contactless? The reason for that is that because of the scale and speed at which, excuse me, the scale and speed at which the U.S. Issuers wanted to migrate to EMV, they decided to pick the simplest and least common denominator of the technology, which was contact EMV with no pin enabled. So it was just a technological choice to pick the simplest form of the technology so as to get to market faster and solve this problem of card-present fraud.
That makes sense.
And remember,
we also. I'm sorry.
No, and I was just going to say, remember the drivers for this urgency was these huge data breaches that we saw in 2014-ish, right? The Target breach, the Home Depot breach, so many others, unfortunately, that caused mass reissuance of cards here in the U.S.
That's true. And now we're seeing a number of people are asking questions about security. So they're saying, what kind of security issues exist with contactless? Aren't they more prone to being skimmed than regular cards? There could be a loss of personal information. Can you speak to that concern? So we've had like 6 questions about security. That's kind of the gist of it.
About that topic. Okay, very good. Yes. So regarding security, contactless EMV provides exactly the same level of security that a contact EMV card does, exactly. So no change at all. And there's no additional risk to using contactless cards than there is to using cards in general. The loss of personal information is no more at risk on contactless than it is on a contact card.
We have a question here about.
Sorry, and as a matter of fact, I just thought of something. As a matter of fact, there's less information available on the contactless interface than there is on the front of the card because, for example, we remove the cardholder name in the contactless profile. So that key piece of information is not available via the contactless interface, and it is printed on the front of the card.
Are there limits to the ticket size for contactless transactions in the U.S. and in the U.K.?
So in the U.S., it depends on merchant categories, and it's typically $50 for no cardholder verification, so no PIN, no signature.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions someone has asked is that card not present fraud is pretty much all of their fraud at this point. What is being done to address this issue?
Okay. We understand that is also a commonly seen effect of the migration. There are many possible ways to secure card not present fraud, including BCV, which is a technology that we've deployed that changes the nature of the CVV value or the CVC value on the back of the card from static to dynamic. And this dynamic CVV solution doesn't change the consumer experience with the merchant online, right? They would type in their credit card number, cardholder name, expiration date in exactly the same way, and they would type in the CVV in the same way, except they would get that CVV value from either a companion mobile application on their device, or through the use of an electronic ink display on the back of their card. That would update that CVV every 20 minutes, so it would become a dynamic value. And there are other ways to secure e-commerce, but we can discuss that offline for whoever has questions about that, because we can get a lot deeper.
And Gemalto does have a solution for the dynamic CVV. When we originally sent out this invitation for this webinar, we also piggybacked it with Gemalto's last week webinar on card not present fraud. So when I upload this recording, I will also put the card not present fraud webinar from last week, so that might help people better understand that. Philippe, we always get this question. Somebody wants to know a difference in contactless cards in price versus standard EMV cards. Do we have any idea about that?
Yeah, there is a delta, but yeah, there is a delta, but in general, it's hard to say without knowing a little more detail about what this issuer wants to do. I suggest we talk about it offline. And the benefit is that by deploying contactless in card form factor, you are providing the same consumer experience to your card holders, so you're differentiating yourselves with your card holders and allowing your card to become top of wallet without to Apple Pay or other mobile payments forms, which themselves bring additional costs, such as requiring you to pay a percentage of the transactions. So by taking control of your contactless deployment form factor, putting it on your cards, you eliminate this cannibalization, if you will, of your transaction fees that you would otherwise have to pay to the mobile provider.
And we have just a couple more basic questions about the current EMV stock. Can they be adjusted to add contactless, or is that not the case?
Unfortunately not. It's not as easy as that. The contactless card is actually built in a specific way with the antenna as part of the antenna being a core component of the card body, and it's also a different kind of chip.
And this one, I think you kind of explained it a little bit before. Someone asked, who selects the maximum dollar amount for contactless payments? Is it all done on the merchant side, or the processor? Who's making that decision?
So it's a decision made by the brands themselves. Then the merchants have a certain amount of leeway in how they implement it. But in any case, these limits only determine the amount below which no cardholder verification is required. So no PIN, no signature, no nothing, just tap and go, take your stuff, and leave the store, right? For transactions that are above those limits, let's say you want to buy a HD TV or whatever, you can still tap to pay for that HD TV, but cardholder verification would be required, so you would need to sign the receipt for any amount above the limit.
And he has a question about, I just think they need a little bit more clarity about the card itself. So EMV, contactless, and dynamic CVV, are these all plastics?
Yes, so EMV is the underlying security technology. EMV chip cards are on a plastic, yes. They're the chip cards that are being deployed right now. Contactless EMV is also on a chip card, on a plastic. Contactless EMV can also be on a mobile device, okay? But we haven't really talked about that during this webinar. We're mostly referring to the plastic form factor of contactless and chip EMV. And then DCV, that can be added as an additional feature, either using a companion application on your mobile device or by purchasing a specific kind of plastic that adds an e-ink display where the CVV is currently printed / embossed, right? So the DCV is kind of a specialized plastic if you want that form factor. It has a processor specifically dedicated to generating this code. It has a battery, and it has an e-ink display, which is what you find on your Kindles, for example, your Amazon or your ebook readers.
That's the perfect description, because it looks like a tiny, tiny little itty-bitty Kindle display, like a little gray screen. Now we're getting a lot more questions. I think we're kind of getting everybody stirred up about things. Here's one about the instant issue. I'm not sure, Philippe, how much knowledgeable you are about that, but can they use their instant issue printers to create contactless EMV cards? Or is it just a matter of changing stock? It's just a different card stock.
Right. So there's a little more to it than that. So earlier in the presentation, I was mentioning that an issuer wanting to migrate to EMV can benefit from the Shoreline Processor Ready program, right, where we've done a lot of the work that you need to complete in order to get to EMV for traditional issuance. And that same work can also enable an issuer with in-branch or instant issuance. And they would need two things. The issuer would need a special EMV-capable printer, and they would need the contactless card stock.
I'm almost positive the ones that Shoreline that we do offer are EMV ready. They are EMV ready products.
Yes, that is correct. Yes.
Someone asked, is it possible to leapfrog, if they haven't started their EMV implementation yet, leapfrog over the EMV chip card and go right to contactless instead of skipping over the standard EMV card. And that's
right.
We have customers doing that right now. I mean, Shoreline is producing those cards.
Yeah, absolutely, and you're exactly right. We are producing those cards. So the answer is absolutely, on the card body side, and as long as your processor is ready for that.
Okay. Someone asked, how can this really be secure, an EMV card, when you're not using a signature or a PIN? How can this contactless EMV be truly secure?
So EMV, remember that the purpose of EMV was to prevent card cloning, lost and stolen fraud, and the major causes of that kind of fraud were data breaches and the fact that fraudsters could take a card number and basic transaction data and then clone cards based on that. So EMV was brought in to add a dynamic component to the transactions in the form of a transaction cryptogram, right? A cryptogram that changes with every single transaction based on some secret keys that are in the chip and some cryptographic technology. Because all of the variants of EMV for face-to-face payments at the point of sale use this technology, this cryptography, this dynamic cryptogram that changes with every transaction, plus many other security mechanisms. It is infinitely more secure than what mag stripes were when you swiped and you had to sign a receipt. And so it eliminates the need for necessarily having to sign for a receipt or enter a PIN on the credit side, right? On the debit side, of course, PINs have always been used and they will continue to be used in the EMV world.
On this one, I'm not sure. This is more of a merchant question, but I think you might be able to answer it. It says, so not 100% of terminals today support contactless because the software that they need has not been downloaded. So the machine can do it, but the merchant has not, downloaded the software.
Right. So actually, the devices are completely contactless capable, and the software is downloaded. What's going on is that not all merchants have enabled it or turned it on and gone through the contactless certification process. So everything is ready for merchants to turn on that capability in the terminals and get them certified for contactless.
We have a question about how contactless cards work with mobile payments. Can a bank issue cards and then also have the same card on their cardholder's smartphone, on their iPhone?
Yes, they can, as long as they sign the required agreements with the mobile technology providers to be able to do that.
Someone asked about the wearables. Now, what if somebody lost their wearable wristband? How does this technology help with chargebacks or liability?
It's the same use case as losing the card in your pocket. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's no different than if you lost your actual plastic in your pocket.
So it's like having your card but on your arm.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, I think we've peppered you enough, Philippe, and you've risen to the occasion. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.
I appreciate it, and I know we all appreciate it. And we'll be definitely sending a copy of this presentation out to everybody who attended, and even people who weren't able to make it, and putting it on our website along with the recording, and also the Card Not Present webinar from last week, which I think will really help people understand dynamic CVV and what that entails and the offering for that. And we should be having another webinar towards the end of the summer, and thank you everybody. If anybody has any suggestions of topics they want to talk, they think are important, please send them to us. And have a great afternoon. Thank you for taking the time today. Thank you again, Philippe.
Okay, you're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.